5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. Welcome back, everyone. This is the Shift Method Podcast. We're already on episode 5, if you can believe that. We're just going to keep pumping out content for all of you. And today we're going to be shifting gears a little bit in terms of who we're having a conversation with. One of my mottos, or I should say one of my goals, if you know anything about me, is to bridge the gap between strength and conditioning and physical therapy. Reason being, and you'll probably hear me say this again later on this podcast, is that as personal trainers, as strength and conditioning coaches, we learn a little bit about pain and injury and maybe, what are some common signs and symptoms. But in terms of working with people who actually have an injury or are dealing with some kind of pain, we aren't really given too much guidance right now. And there's a lot of people who are kind of in that in-between space where they don't necessarily need a physical therapist anymore, but we don't maybe have the tools and skill sets to help them in terms of a strength conditioning or personal training route. And that's why today I have a very special guest, Morgan Sunderland, to talk about all things physical therapy, all things pain and injury science, and we're going to bust in this as well. Morgan, can you go ahead and introduce yourself to the people?
Hi, everyone. My name is Morgan. I am a student at the University of Miami for physical therapy, my second year. And I met Damien back in undergrad. We worked together, exercise science undergrad students. And I'm so excited. Damien is one of the smartest people I know. And he's always seeking out new information, new sources. So can't wait to get into all this discussion today.
Well, thank you. You're too kind. Yes, Morgan and I worked together. We were personal trainers back at Florida Atlantic University's campus recreation center. So a lot of good times, a lot of great discussions, and she's been a great friend through all this. So really, really excited to have you on the podcast today, Morgan. So for all my young PTs out there, this is someone you want to listen to. She's one of the smartest people, not just for physical therapy, but we're talking exercise science. You were even in a exercise physiology bowl, right? Like a student bowl, right? Can you talk to people about that for a second?
Oh my gosh, I really liked X-Phys in undergrad, and our professor, he invited me to come compete for our school against all the other exercise science programs in the Southeast region. So it was basically a Jeopardy style event, all things X-Phys. I think I still have a lot of that X-Phys knowledge in my brain somewhere, even though I've been doing a lot more PT stuff lately. But it was really cool. Yeah, I loved it. Loved every minute of it.
So yeah, very, very smart. Exercise science in general, nerd is best way to describe Morgan if I had to put a phrase on it. So definitely would want to pay attention to her. But specifically, we're going to be talking about physical therapy today. So Morgan, can you just kind of outline, maybe to give some people some guidance, some young exercise science professionals, or people who are maybe considering going into exercise science, maybe with a concentration or a career path towards physical therapy? Can you kind of just talk about the application process, some requirements that are usually people have to have in order to get into PT school?
Yeah, so if you are considering PT, I would definitely recommend give yourself at least 2 years to get yourself set up for success for the application process. Probably even more if you can go into undergrad knowing that you want to do PT, that's ideal, because no matter what major you choose, there are different prereqs that you're probably going to have to take outside of your major to get into PT school. Like, for example, I was an exercise science major, which I would say is one of the most common undergrad majors to have, that and kinesiology. But you need to take a lot of physics classes, physics 1 and 2, chemistry 1 and 2, biology 1 and 2, typically, anatomy and physiology, which we took as exercise science majors. So you need to know ahead of time and give yourself time to plan for those extra courses outside of what your major is going to be, or else that'll just add a little bit of time to your undergrad experience. And then it does take time to build a network for yourself, build some good experiences as well, because PT schools are really looking for diversity in your experiences, your background. So one thing you need is good shadowing observation hours in a PT setting. They want to see a variety of settings. So not just working at an outpatient orthopedic clinic for a couple of years. They want to see that you've seen neuro settings, you've seen ortho settings, maybe you've seen cardio pulm. So really getting diverse experience both in PT and in other fields, not PT, but PT related, such as personal training, getting involved in research. So it really takes time to actually build yourself up and build your diverse experiences. It's not something that you can just figure out your last year of undergrad. Oh, I want to go to PT school. Maybe you can, but it's something that you should be working on for a long time.
It's like you can, but you might be spending a little bit longer than you want to, right?
Yeah. And you're not doing yourself any favors by doing that too, because the more diverse experiences you can get, the more well-rounded you're going to be, and you're going to have more information and be able to consider other viewpoints as well, which is going to just help shape your practice throughout life. And then you need, of course, recommendation letters. So one thing that's really important is building good connections with the people around you. Always, everyone could, you can help them out one day, and maybe they can help you out as well one day. So making sure you're building relationships with your professors, not just being that quiet student, even if you're a great student, not just being that quiet student that does amazing on tests, but never actually interacts with their professors.
Yep.
So that was something that I knew I had to do, because earlier on in undergrad, I was timid. I did well in school. I was a bookworm, kept my head in the books, but didn't really converse with my professors outside of the classroom. So I made that a priority of mine, to start to build relationships, get to know them, learn from them, use them as mentors, and then one day they can write you a good recommendation letter getting into PT school.
Yep. Do not burn any bridges, people. I
Yeah,
know it's, and burning a bridge doesn't necessarily have to be, you do something egregious, or, you backtalk your professor, which you should never do. But burning bridges could be something as simple as just ignoring an opportunity that you could have taken, or maybe a professor wanted to help you out. Maybe you just said, maybe I don't need help right now. Professors know people, and they have a lot of contacts, and they can get you into amazing places. So if you know a professor, even not just physical therapy, any kind of field, but specifically in the exercise science field, or if you're in campus rec, because campus rec is this big, everyone knows everyone, do not burn any bridges, people. Please take it from me. I've been in campus rec for how long now? 5 years. Okay. Everyone knows everyone. Do not burn any bridges. So going a little bit back to the coursework real quick, Morgan, one strategy that I've heard PT students do is use some of those elective hours or those elective credits to pick up those extra courses, like the chemistry, the calc, and all that stuff. Was that a strategy that you used and maybe you found helpful?
Yeah, so for me, we have some open electives, however many credits it was. I think we needed to take maybe 5 or 6 electives as part of our curriculum for undergrad. So if you know ahead of time what classes you need, say you're still lacking Chem 2, Physics 2, and a psychology class or something like that, you can usually talk to your academic advisor, and if they know that PT is the route that you're going toward, they can sub in those typical exercise science electives for the other classes. Now, of course, that's difficult too, because usually elective courses are a little bit easier, a little less time consuming. And I will tell you, Physics 2, Chem 2, statistics, classes like that, they're equally as time consuming. So taking those with your normal course load can be a little difficult. So you really do have to kind of, I would say, look at particular schools. Schools have some in common, but each school has their own little differences here and there as far as what they require. So go through those, have a list, know exactly what you need to take, and then try to plan it out by semester, so you're not taking all these crazy hard classes at once. And I did plan that out well in advance, because the last thing you want to do is be taking exercise physiology, kinesiology, a few other exercise science classes, and then also as your electives, you're taking Physics 2 and Chem 2. Yeah. And they come with labs too, so it comes with all of that additional time and
And sometimes
energy.
you're just unlucky, right? And sometimes you just get dropped with all those courses, and then you happen to have, 4 tests in one day, because it's as if the exercise science professors all got together and were like, this is test day today, right? You don't want to be taking X phys, kines, like Morgan was saying, and get dropped with tests in 1 week. It is very, very difficult. So finding a good advisor, planning out, your program, right? I'm pretty sure, I know FAU did. I actually liked FAU had the really nice outline. It's like, here for undergrad is everything that's required of you. You have to do like, 1 class from this section, 1 class from history, 2 classes from arts, whatever. And I had this sheet and I kept it all 4 years there. And I would make sure I checked off. I would visit my advisor at least once a semester, usually in the beginning and end, be like, hey, I passed this, here's this. Am I going the right direction? What should I outline next? Make sure I had as balanced of a semester as possible, where I wasn't, loading super heavily in one thing. I always made sure I gave myself a buffer of what I would consider more of like an elective, or maybe in our program, we had a lot of active classes actually that were a combination of learning and actually like practical. So that way I had like a little bit of a buffer on my brain as well. So it wasn't just XPhys, kines, testing, all that stuff. So if you can plan out with your advisor and make sure you stay up to date, it'll make your life a whole lot easier, especially going to PT, where you do have those challenging electives where normally they would be used as a buffer. Now you got to pick up those calc and those chem 2s. So make sure you really take the time to invest in planning that out properly.
Right. And another thing I want to say too, I know a lot of people like to take those kind of seminar large classes like chemistry, statistics, that people like to take them maybe at a community college and have them transferred over. But it's really important to check with whatever PT school you're trying to apply to.
A really good point.
Some of them, they won't accept online classes. They won't accept classes that were AP credit from high school. They won't accept community college classes.
Mm-hmm.
So it's important to check that. And I'm sure it's changing a lot now with COVID too.
Oh, yeah.
Because now, of course, a lot of classes are online. So I'm sure that has changed. But definitely check ahead of time. Before you sign up for any class, check, make sure it's transferable, check, make sure it's going to be accepted, because nothing's worse than taking a course, working hard in it, just to find out it doesn't count and you have to take it again somewhere else.
No, that would be horrible.
That never happened to me, but I do know people that
Yeah, I've heard it too.
That's why I say at least 2 years, honestly, just to set up your timeline, figure out your plan. Is you need a timeline for what classes you're taking when, and when you're doing, say, your shadowing hours, when you're taking your GRE, all of that fun stuff.
Oh, the GRE. SAT on steroids. That was really fun.
I would have done better if I took it in high school.
Oh, 1,000%. 1,000% would have done better. I always say, I think the GRE should be based on your program. It should be,
I 100% agree.
Yeah, that would be a lot better. But that's not here or there, right?
I get the GRE. They want to see that you're good at standardized tests.
Yes.
Especially for like PT or something where you do have to take an exam at the end of it to pass and become licensed.
This is
so
true.
They want to see you're actually going to pass.
So they can invest in you.
You're a good test taker. But is that the best test to show how you're going to do with PT? No.
I'm not in PT school, but yeah, I would probably guess probably not the best test to check on that.
Some PT schools are actually thinking of dropping it. I think some may have. Yeah.
Wow.
So
shout out to PT schools for doing that.
We'll see. Keep your eye out for that.
Yeah, right. Now, Morgan, you alluded to this a little bit earlier about COVID and how that might change the online coursework. So you were in basically the height of your program when this thing hit, and you guys had to change a lot, which I'm sure, I mean, for those who don't know in terms of getting into like the practical side of your PT school, it's intense. You're with the same group of people, very small group, very high workload, and it's a lot of physical contact, a lot of close quarters, a lot of testing on each other. A little hard to do during a pandemic. So Morgan, can you just talk about what PT school is like in general and how COVID has impacted that for you?
Yeah, so before COVID had hit, PT school is obviously a very hands-on profession. You don't learn PT from being online. You don't learn it just from sitting in the classroom. You learn your foundational knowledge in the classroom, but then you always follow that up with practicing on your classmates, getting hands-on experience, getting your feedback from professors, having them do things on you so you can feel what's correct and what's not correct. And typically before COVID, PT school was basically a 9-to-5 job as far as just being in the classroom. So how it was set up was Monday through Friday. We had class, it was actually 8 to 5 most days with a 1-hour lunch break of just straight classes. And it would be a combination of lecture and lab. So a lot of times they'll split up. We'll have long classes. We have 4-hour long classes sometimes. And maybe it'll be 2 hours of just sitting and lecturing. And then the second 2 hours, you're in the lab practicing what we just talked about. So at least you would get that combination of sitting, learning book stuff, and then actually hands-on practice, and kind of it sticks in your brain better, of course, when you practice it right away too. Especially first semester, anatomy semester, that was a hard one because you spend probably about 4 hours a day dissecting a cadaver, and that's after a couple hours of lecture. So everything, like I said, very hands-on. That's how you learn it. I mean, things made a little bit of sense when you listen to the lecture, but they don't truly click and kind of stick with you until you get to practice it and feel it for yourself and see it for yourself. And when COVID hit for me, I was in the middle of my first year, probably the most important, just foundational, one of the most foundational semesters of PT school, because you go into your big classes like ortho, which is a lot of us are going to be practicing ortho outpatient, therapeutic exercise, electrotherapy, basically things that we do as PTs every single day. And it hit about halfway through the semester before we had any of our practicals, before we finished with our lab. And the
perfect timing, right? Just perfect timing.
The professors who have been doing this for years, they had to completely switch their method of teaching and try to adapt to online just as much as we had to adapt to learning online. And it was frustrating, to say the least, for a long time. Our professors did a great job. They did the very best they could of adapting and figuring out what we needed, and they made changes as we provided them with feedback for what we needed. But I didn't feel confident at first. I really didn't feel confident actually being in a clinic now, because I haven't had my hands on anyone in a long time. I haven't actually practiced this stuff. Just talked about it. And it, like I said, it doesn't stick as well when you haven't actually practiced it. Now you just have a bunch of knowledge flying at you left and right, and it's somehow supposed to stay in your brain. But they did end up doing a good job of providing this with all the didactic coursework online until we were allowed to come back in person. Things have changed a lot since we've been back in person. First of all, of course, the face mask and the face shield, which is even harder than a face mask. Hard to breathe, hard to talk, but just great. We're all just grateful that we're allowed to come back and practice on each other, because it really makes all the difference. And then a big difference as well is now you're working with one partner, and you have to stick with that one partner.
That's got to be tough.
Because every body is so different. No one's the same. You learn that in anatomy early on when you're dissecting cadavers. You look in a textbook and, oh, this nerve's here. And
it's not even close, dude. It's not even close.
Everyone's so different. Some
I'm
people
like, what muscle is this? This doesn't belong here.
Muscles. Some people have muscles that are fused together.
Yep.
And so, yeah, some people have extra muscles or don't have a muscle at all. So it's very, very different, as you can see, both on a cadaver and just from feeling different bodies, practicing in different classes. So you kind of need that diverse experience of feeling multiple different bodies to really understand what's going on. So that's been hard. Luckily for me, I live with a bunch of PT students, which a lot, if you do go to PT school, you'll probably end up in this situation as well, because PT school is expensive. So you just fit as many of you as you can into one home and try to make it work. And then you guys are with each other 24/7.
Yep.
So at least get to practice on a few of them. But that's made it a lot harder. And now I'm learning more in the clinic. Now I get to work on different patients. So I'm learning more that way. But it has been difficult for sure.
Yeah. And that's actually a really good point. I always talk about how personal trainers, a big quality that I look for or try to teach is adaptability. Physical therapy is no different, right? You, things are going to change constantly. Like Morgan mentioned, when it comes to being able to work with different types of people, because you can read a textbook all day long. You can know every muscle in the body, every bone, every joint, every ligament. When you work with a real person, oh, shit hits the fan real quick. You're like, this isn't what I thought it was. So if you have the opportunity to, I know this can be tough for some people. I'll be blunt. I was excited. It was a little eye-opening when I first did it. I did a cadaver lab in grad school, actually. I was very fortunate to help facilitate a cadaver lab. But if you have the opportunity to do it, I highly recommend doing it because you can actually put your content that you've learned in your anatomy book and actually view a real life representation of it. And you can get a good idea like, wow, things are a lot murkier than I thought they were. Just like Morgan was explaining, the reason why I was laughing so much, it was the same thing. I think I had four, it was either 3 or 4 labs in total. And we would look at 2 to 3 bodies at a time in the lab. And each one was different. I like to credit myself. I have pretty good anatomy background. I've taken pure anatomy coursework. I had to do, I think, 9 credit hours plus 3 credit hours of lab. So I've had about 12 credit hours of just purely anatomy and physiology. It doesn't include ex-phys, biomechanics, anything like that. So I have a pretty good anatomy base. When I looked at that cadaver, I felt like I didn't really know much. Everything changed. I'm trying to identify muscles, and I'm having a problem. I had the forearm open, and I'm like, I don't know where I am. I felt like I was given a map in a foreign language. So if you have the opportunity to work in a cadaver lab, even just to do it as like an extracurricular thing, maybe your professor offers it for extra credit or for you to just do it to help supplement your learning, please take the opportunity because it is extraordinarily beneficial.
I totally agree. And that's a great way to understand the human body, and really we'll see how we vary so much and kind of get comfortable with knowing that things are not black and white, because that's so important to know. I know for myself, I'm very science-based. I like to have an answer, and the more that I am in PT and working with real people, and it started even with just working in the cadaver lab, things are not black and white, and they will not be, and you have to get comfortable with that and know that there's so many variations and things aren't always going to fit the patterns that we learned in a textbook or we learned in school.
Morgan's speaking my language here. When you work with people, what I like to say is it's not, and this is not a shot at my engineers. I love my engineer students. I went to Purdue. You guys are awesome. You guys and gals are awesome. But working with people is not like working on a piece of machinery. There is the biological component, the more set in stone, clear cut in some instances. But when you're working with a person, you have to take into account the psychological and social aspects. It is more of a gradient, more of a spectrum when you're working with people. And there is a lot of gray area and uncertainty, not just with anatomy and physiology. It goes with, we're going to talk about in a little bit, with pain and injury, with certain modalities and rehab practices. So get comfortable with, more or less shit hitting the fan quite often, because it's going to happen and it's humbling, but it makes you a more resilient individual because it makes you more competent to attack complex problems. So don't shy away from it.
For sure. And adaptability, definitely probably one of the best qualities no matter what field you're in. Just in general, just to get through life, you got to roll with the punches. And I think I used to freak out when things weren't what I was expecting them to be. And now I just go with it.
It's kind of fun. And personally, in my opinion, it's kind of fun. It's like a new challenge. I like it now, but I'm just like you, Mark. It used to scare me. Used to scare the crap out of me. I'm like, this isn't what I read. It's like, yeah, sorry, kid. Figure it out.
Exactly.
Morgan, the last part I want to touch on with your experience and going through PT school is kind of this little thing we talked about, which is your view on coursework requirements in general. So can you just kind of lead our audience into a little bit of a highlight of that conversation we had in terms of your view on coursework for PT school?
Right. So They're very, very similar no matter what PT school you end up going to, because all PT schools are trying to prepare you for the boards eventually. That's the end goal. The end goal is to be a good practicing PT, but also to pass the boards. So we have to study a certain way, learn certain materials that are going to be on that exam so that we can become licensed physical therapists. Now, with many board exams, with any kind of licensure or certification exams, things can be a bit old school, and some things that are have become very important haven't quite made it on there yet. And so I think a lot of the coursework we have, very important to become good overall general PTs. However, with the requirements to get into PT school, we're missing something. Depending on, so what PTs are missing, in my opinion, is that really good understanding of exercise and progressive overload, programming, like truly learning how to train and periodization, any of those models. So we learn about the body, we learn about muscles, we learn about movement, but we don't actually learn how to program exercises. So going into PT school, you can literally have any major, any undergraduate major. It doesn't have to be science related. There are a few people I know that had like religious studies as a major, or accounting. And in some ways that's all well and good, because diversity, that'll help you in weird ways that I can't even think of, but it'll give you experiences that could potentially make you a better PT and understand your patients. It'll bring something to the table. That's why PT schools like to see diversity. But the problem is the prereqs to get into PT school, like I said, anatomy and physiology, very important, but then you have chem, physics, bio, stats. While those classes are a little important, they're still not teaching you that foundational exercise knowledge that you really need if we're going to claim to be movement and exercise specialists. So you expect, okay, if those are the prereqs to get into PT school, then we must really, really dive deep into exercise and programming once we're actually in PT school. And I quickly learned that was not the case as well. So for myself, I'm okay because I have that good undergrad exercise science background. I've worked as a trainer. I've worked at a strength and conditioning facility before, so I feel pretty comfortable and confident in my abilities. However, those students and my classmates that maybe didn't get the same undergrad background, and they don't know a whole lot about exercise, so they still, to this day, they're in the clinic and they feel not very confident with their ability to program exercises or to choose correct exercises. Yes, they know the names of movements, but coming up with actual exercises to do, it doesn't come naturally to them. Learning how to progressively overload a patient, they don't know how to do that. So you get the cookie cutter, 3 sets of 10 for everything, every single patient. Don't know when to add more resistance or when to change that cookie cutter set and reps. And it's just a problem for us as a profession to claim to be exercise specialists and experts in this field, but there's really nowhere where you're required to have that exercise knowledge and expertise. You can, some people do, but a lot of PTs, they only know a few basic exercises they learned in the clinic, and they just go with that, and it's unfortunate to me. I also know a lot of physical therapists that require someone else to train them. They require a trainer to be able to exercise properly. And I think as physical therapists, we should know how to do that on our own, right? There's no harm in asking for help. I mean, I would ask you for help just like you would come to me for help in something.
Exactly.
There's no harm in that, but it's just something that I think we can better ourselves in so we can help our patients and we can explain to them with more confidence why we're choosing these exercises and how it's helping them, and create more individualized programs for everyone.
The way that I view it, and first off, this needs to be prefaced, because the reason we're talking about this is because Morgan, you're not going to find someone who cares more about this field than Morgan. And like she's kind of alluded to, Morgan is the type of person that likes to know how she can make her field, her peers, her profession better. Might say that she's trying to shift it a little bit, right? Shift it towards a better direction. That comes with having those difficult conversations about, hey, here's maybe where our field can do better. This isn't to shun anyone. This is so we can find out and discuss together how we can make the profession better. Just like I talk about personal training, strength and conditioning. The way that I view physical therapy, and this may not be reality, but this is how I view it, or at least how it should be. Personal trainers, sorry, y'all, we're on the bottom of the totem pole, right? We start there. Strength and conditioning coaches kind of come next. And then physical therapy, you have also maybe athletic training and exercise physiologists. They're kind of like the top tier. Yes, they have slightly different specialties in terms of what they do, but in terms of knowledge, experience, and background in the sciences, I consider them top tier. I would hope that my physical therapist, who's getting a doctorate in physical therapy now, right, DPT,
Yep.
that they have an extensive background, more so than your typical, bachelor's program, more so than your typical master's program. And all that we're trying to point out is that maybe if the coursework could be restructured, because I've always kind of laughed, and I understand there is some merit to just having students do rigorous coursework. I get it. Can you handle calc? Can you handle Chem 2? Can you handle physics? I get it. But at the end of the day, rather than spending the money on, and I'm not saying the courses are completely useless, like Morgan said, like there's value to stats, right? It's very important to understand general concepts of stats so you can read, research, interpret it, and use it in your practice. Chemistry, extremely helpful for physiology, nutrition, things like that. Physics is even helpful. Wouldn't it make more sense to make biomechanics a requirement instead of physics? Because that's a specific form of physics on the human body that you use in your job day to day. Wouldn't a nutrition chemistry class be more specific to our field? Calc, I could be wrong here. Someone help me out. I don't see why you need calculus. I know that you use some mathematics, but honestly, in my experience with most equations that we've worked in, unless Morgan, I'm missing some super secret equation that helps you in your job, going past algebra 2 and stats doesn't really make much sense for me in the general scope of our field until you get maybe into a very high medical profession or a very extreme biomechanics route that might require some trigonometry and calculus. I just don't see the need for it. So when it comes to coursework, we're more so just trying to highlight maybe how the field can be not only more efficient for the teachers in terms of assigning coursework, but also for the students to best set them up for success.
Exactly. And like you said, there is some merit to taking those very difficult courses to see if you can handle it. And also just seeing if you're really willing to put the work in.
Mm-hmm.
Because so many people in our program in undergrad said they wanted to be physical therapists. What percent of those people actually pursued it? A lot of them dropped off just because they didn't want to take the prereqs or they didn't take the GRE or something. So part of it's too, how hard are you willing to work for this? And that makes sense. But it makes less sense to take those courses and skip out on things that are actually essential to what we're doing every single day. And we do take biomechanics, of course, in PT school.
Yeah.
But I think that you should come in with a little bit of that background knowledge already, so you're not thrown for a loop, right, when you're in PT school just learning this for the first time. So
I remember, shout out to Professor Borum at Florida Atlantic, when we would go into his intro class, and the realest man you'll ever meet. He's awesome professor. He teaches a couple things, TSAC, tactical strength conditioning, intro, and he taught I think it was management principles. I can't remember the name of the course, but he taught a few classes at FAU. And for his intro class, it was kind of what I sometimes talk about with people on this podcast, is about various professions you can get into as an exercise science professional. And like Morgan said, everyone who comes in exercise science, they want to be a PT. It's like 90% of the crowd, right?
Right.
And so Professor Borum, first day of class, he would be like, all right, raise your hand if you want to be a physical therapist. Like everyone in the class raised their hand. He's like, cool, okay, that's going to change at the end of the semester. And you think, you're like, who is this dick? What is he saying? No. He like, I remember when he calculated out like how much money it generally costs for like your average program. And he's also like a business guy. And he like calculates the interest compounded over time. He's like, that's a mortgage on a house right there. And everyone's just like sitting there fuming. And they're like, holy shit, do I really want to do this?
He's spitting truth at us.
The man is as honest. And he's not, he's, they call him like the dad of Florida Atlantic. Like he tells it as it is, but he's a very kind person when you talk to him one-on-one about it. So if you're thinking about physical therapy, I'm not trying to discourage you from it, but make sure it's really what you want. Because like Morgan said, it's a lot of money. It's a lot of time. It's a big investment. It's a 7-year program in total. So make sure it's really what you want.
Yeah. I was going to say for advice, that's probably one of the biggest pieces of advice I'd give. Know your why and make sure it's a valid why.
Absolutely.
If someone asks you why you want to do PT and you're thinking, I don't know, it sounds cool. I get to work with injuries. I get to be on my feet. I like to be active in my job and I want to make a lot of money. Well, those aren't really great reasons, especially making a lot of money, because trust me, there are other professions you can make more money in and not get yourself into hundreds of $1,000s of debt in the process. So don't do it unless you really know you want to do it and you love it.
Yep. You'll be in debt for a hot minute. So, and my understanding, there's not many like graduate assistantships or scholarships that can really help. So it's coming out of your pocket. So get ready to pay.
And you can't really work during PT school either.
Even if you wanted to, it's very difficult.
Some schools actually forbid you from working.
Mine doesn't,
but it's difficult for sure. So that is something to consider. And I'm glad that Borum made us consider that, because I really did do some soul searching before I just went right in.
Yep. Think about it and then think about it again.
Yeah.
So Morgan, thank you for kind of outlining your process in becoming a PT. I think that was really good information for people who are either on track, maybe even in right now, and also maybe some students who are thinking about joining the exercise science field. So thank you for that. We're now going to dive into, this is the part that I'm really excited about. That's busting some physical therapy myths, right? If you know me, pain, injury, and science around those topics are kind of the big things I like to talk about. Morgan and I share a love for talking about some things that we think not necessarily are always wrong, but maybe that the emerging research is showing that it's a lot more complicated than we once thought. I'm going to preface this section kind of like I did with my podcast with Hannah Thompson. When it comes to disagreement, right? You're going to find that, me personally, I'm a skeptical person. I disagree with a lot of things when it comes to my field. I say things about my field because I'm in it, right? I want it to be better. So I say, we need to work on this, we need to improve on that, yada, yada, yada. When it comes to disagreeing with something, it's important to make sure that we separate people from ideas, right? You can go on Instagram right now, you can go on Twitter and find people arguing left and right about, should you squat below parallel? Should you do this? Is this bad? Is this good? And people just verbally assault each other on a daily basis. There will be none of that here. We're talking about ideas, and we separate ideas from people, right? Morgan and I probably have stuff we disagree on. My friends and I, we have stuff we disagree on. And guess what? At the end of the day, we still love each other. We're still friends. Having disagreements is good, because if you only watch, listen, read things you agree with, you're setting yourself up for failure because you don't know your blind spots. I've mentioned this before. I purposely follow people, especially on Instagram. I follow professionals I don't agree with. I read research I don't maybe necessarily agree with the preface of what it's saying in the beginning. I do my best to read books about subjects that maybe I thought I disagree with initially. Because if I don't, I'm leaving myself open to, not steel manning my arguments. And maybe I might be wrong in one instance. And then I learn, and then I can adapt, and I can better serve my clients. So just know that if you're holding particular beliefs, try not to be married to any ideas, right? Always be open to change, even though change is difficult. And be willing to have difficult conversations in a polite and constructive manner. Because if we can't have these conversations, then we're doing our people a disservice, which ultimately, that's part of the reason why we're in this field, is to be a source of reputable information and to work on helping our clients, our patients, whatever it may be. So I preface that. Now we're going to get into some myths, right? So a big one that we're going to talk about, three main ones. The first one is going to be about static stretching. This is a myth that just doesn't seem to go away. But there is a lot of emerging research I'm seeing coming out. And I do maybe see a little bit of a shift online when it comes to, what the research says, the validity of it. Morgan, I'm just going to ask you to kind of kick this off. Can you kind of just outline for our audience what static stretching is and maybe some common misconceptions about static stretching and how it helps with things like injury, tight muscles, things of that nature?
So static stretching is supposed to be a passive process where you're trying to lengthen a muscle or lengthen the fascia, the tissues around it, to increase overall mobility. And commonly, you always hear from PTs and in our realm that muscles are tight. Always, we have tight muscles, and when something's tight, PT 101 says, stretch it if it's tight, strengthen it if it's weak. And to some extent, that does hold some value. If something really truly is tight and you have limited range of motion to the point where you're not able to perform activities that you need to do on a daily basis, static stretching has some value in that aspect. However, because it is a passive process, you're not actively using your muscles, you're not actively using that range of motion. You're passively, or a PT, or maybe you're using a strap or something, is passively trying to lengthen those muscles. You're not getting the full benefit of that, first of all, because now you're opening up, say, a new range of motion that you don't have active control in. Mm-hmm. And that can actually increase your risk for injury. So way back when, I know people used to think static stretching before exercising was a good warm-up. And that has already been a myth that's kind of been busted. We don't usually do static stretching before exercise, especially something that's going to be a speed, power type of exercise. If you're going out to play on a field, static stretching beforehand is typically not great because, like I said, you're opening up a range of motion that you now haven't built strength throughout that range of motion if you're just stretching it, and you're altering the length tension relationship of that muscle. So it's kind of like an elastic band that's been stretched out and doesn't have good recoil if you overstretch it. First of all, you're losing that length tension relationship. Second of all, like I said, if you don't have active control in that, you're doing yourself a disservice because you don't want to have an open range of motion where you can't actively control that motion. That's where injury occurs.
Yep. It's as if your body kind of knows its acceptable range in which it can function in. And in order to gain more range of motion, you have to earn it, meaning you have to strengthen yourself in that particular movement pattern or particular range of motion, and it'll be granted to you over time, right?
Right. See, so another thing is, too, we feel tight a lot of times, so people automatically want to stretch because you feel tight, and automatically we're taught, stretch it out. But what does tight even mean? Tightness, do you just feel tight? Do you feel stiff? Because that's a normal feeling. Yep. There's nothing wrong with that. And this is why it's really, really important for PTs or for strength and conditioning coaches, anyone, to always assess and not just assume. That's kind of a motto of mine: assess, don't assume. Because someone comes in and says, oh, my hamstrings feel super tight today. And okay, yeah, go ahead and start stretching it out. And then you look at their actual range of motion.
And you can fold them like
a mobile. They might have so much range of motion. Their leg is straight back. So are they really tight in that case? No. Do they need to keep stretching? Probably not. Now, if they say they have very limited range of motion to the point where it's affecting their ability to actually function in whatever their daily activities are. Say they're an athlete and they need to be able to flex their hip with their knee straight to at least 90 degrees. And if they can't achieve that, that's when static stretching could have some value.
Mm-hmm.
But once again, I still think it's very important to always follow that up with active range of motion or active assisted range of motion. So if static stretching is something that you determine your patient or client needs because they are genuinely, you assess and they're genuinely limited in their range of motion, doing some static stretching is a good way to open that up. Because if you're limited, say in your shoulder flexion, if you're limited to just 90 degrees, they're not going to be able to pull their arm any higher actively. Sometimes static stretching, you need that to inhibit the muscles, to truly get that relaxation and help bring them into further range of motion. But if you don't follow that up with active range of motion afterward, like I said, you're doing yourself a disservice. That's where injury occurs. You have all these hypermobile individuals too, that they can hyperextend their elbow past 0 degrees, but they're taught to avoid strengthening through that range of motion. So they don't have the control once they're actually put in that position. And the whole point of PT, strength and conditioning, is to prepare you for the demands of your daily life. Are you going to be in that position at some point? Then you need to have control in that position, and you need to be able to you need to be prepared for the demands that are placed on your body.
Yes.
Those are some of my thoughts on static stretching and where it's useful and where it's not.
Right. To highlight one point that Morgan mentioned, the concept of feeling tight. There's hypermobile meaning people who have a greater than average range of motion in a particular joint. There are people who are hypermobile that feel tight. So perception of tightness is not a very good predictor of actual muscle tension, right? Because it's just you happen to feel tight, but when you actually go through a test, the range of motion is different than what you might have perceived it to be. So feeling tight doesn't mean that you necessarily have to stretch something. The other thing too, with static stretching, there's sometimes this misconception that you're actually changing the composition of the muscle. My understanding is that isn't really true from what we can tell right now. Is static stretching is a transient effect that occurs at the neurological level. So you hold the stretch, you're inhibiting certain mechanoreceptors in the body or in the muscle or in the tendon itself, and that causes the body to relax. The reason why it gets so much praise, and understandably so, right? It's like, hey, I didn't have range of motion. I did this stretch for 30 to 60 seconds or whatever, and now I've gained more range of motion. It's almost like an immediate gift that you've just achieved. So I see how people view it as like, look at this amazing thing. Here's the problem. It doesn't last. And if it does last, what else were you doing in combination with your static stretching that might have actually been the reason why you kept it? I really love, there's a gentleman up at USF, I think it's evidence-based practice. I'm butchering up this handle. I'll make sure to put it in the description. But he does a lot of research about physical therapy, and he put out this really great research article talking about, static stretching and does it actually have effects long-term? And like I said, it doesn't seem to. But if you participate in resistance training, things like squats, bench press, whatever, that can help change your range of motion over time. So let's say I'm doing a hip flexor stretch, and then I can get, or a hamstring stretch or whatever lower body stretch, and then I feel like I can get deeper in my squats. But if you just squatted in a controlled manner at an appropriate load and progressively overloaded over time, chances are your squat's going to get better and you're going to get deeper in your squat. That's from a scientific base. And then there's also the anecdotal side, which, you can't ignore. People say, well, I stretch and I feel like I can get into a deeper range of motion. It's true. You can get into a deeper range of motion temporarily. Here's an anecdote. I don't stretch. I'm doing a little bit right now, only because my temporary PT is telling me to do so for a particular issue. Like I said, it's not 100%, don't do it ever. But I more or less do not stretch. I used to have a horrible squat. I could maybe get down to 45 degrees. And over time, because I've gotten better at the skill, I can basically get ass to grass now, no problem. Because my body has gotten comfortable in the range of motion, has acquired that skill, acquired that range of motion, and now I can use it in a functional manner. Now, Morgan also alluded to the point with people who might have tightness and are having trouble getting in a range of motion. I'll use it sometimes if I have a client or athlete who maybe is dealing with some pain and they need to maybe inhibit a certain area just to get through the session, right? For example, I've had a client before, she had chronic, actually Morgan, this was your client too at one point. She had chronic widespread pain, more likely than not, some variation, maybe of fibromyalgia or something. It was undiagnosed. But at some point, or some days, it was kind of hit or miss. She would just be in excruciating pain in certain areas, mostly her upper traps and other areas of the body. And I knew that, hey, she's going to feel better if we do some static stretching so we can just get her through the session so that way she can be physically active. So we would do various types of static stretching. Even though I knew it wasn't helping her long term, in the immediate to kind of calm down her nervous system, calm down the stimulus being presented to that area, I knew that if I could calm it down, we could get through the session and she would feel better at the end. So it does have what I call the feel-good effect, right? If you like it, it's low risk, it's free, and it feels good. So if you like it, sure. Here's all I'm saying. If you're personal training and you're doing 10 to 15 minutes of stretching with your client every session, I'd rather them be on the treadmill for an extra 10 minutes. I'd rather them do an extra set of a few exercises or even a whole new exercise by itself. If you really, if I have a client that says they want to stretch, I'll show them some stretches. I'll be like, hey, you can do these at home, or if you really want to do one or two at the end, sure, we'll do them. But I'd rather have my client moving than personally wasting time doing a bunch of other stretches.
For sure. For sure. It can be useful, like you said, to make them feel good so that they're able to do more exercises and get them to that ultimate goal that you want to get them moving. So in that case, great. Usually it's not going to hurt you too, right?
No.
But there are some times where static stretching, especially if it's done excessively, can be a little bit of a problem too. So hypermobile people actually feel tightness very often.
Yes.
That's been reported time and time again. So they say they feel tight all the time. And what do? They stretch. And all they're doing is just increasing their instabilities by stretching past that. When really what they need to do is start to build that strength and functional mobility throughout their full range.
Yes.
So as far as squatting through a full range too, you're building strength and you're developing functional mobility that you can take with you throughout your day and avoid injuries throughout your day because of it.
Yes. One thing that I heard and I really like the saying is strengthen to lengthen. The stronger you get, the more you practice a certain skill, the better range of motion you'll get into it. And like Morgan said, even in an athletic context, it might not be the best thing for power output. The one caveat that just thinking, I haven't really read any research about this, but trying to put my brain to good use, is certain sports maybe would benefit from maybe a pre or a warm-up static stretching, maybe like combat in terms of like Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, maybe gymnastics, although there's a lot of power in that, so I'm a little on the fence about that, and maybe like dance or ballet. I could see how maybe static stretching prior to activity might be beneficial because that sport requires extreme range of motion in the immediate to perform and dominate in your sport. But most other sports where especially power sports like sprinting is usually the main one we see in research, static stretching, do it long enough and you're actually going to decrease power output. So, and that's for warm up, but maybe not the most beneficial thing for our athletes.
Right. And I have seen, now that I've been working in the clinic for a few weeks, I have seen some merit in more complex injuries. We've had some car accident patients who are pretty beat up, and their range of motion is genuinely limited to the point where it's impacting their function on a day-to-day basis. Some of them, they can't bend their neck. They can't turn around and look because they can't move their neck basically out from just forward-looking position. So in those cases, starting with static stretching to temporarily lengthen the muscles and open that up has been helpful, but it can't end there. That's the problem.
No.
You can't end it with, okay, we just stretched you out, you're good, you have more range of motion now. Then we will follow that up with active assisted or just active range of motion, where now they're actively using their muscles, working through that new range that we kind of just opened up. And that's where you're going to maintain it more.
Exactly. So static stretching isn't horrible. You can do it. Feels good. It's free. It's mostly low risk. So if you like it, sure. Just know that make sure you're spending your time addressing the other things that you're trying to accomplish with your goal as well, and supplement if you do choose to do static stretching. Morgan, the next one I want to move on to is manual therapy. So can you kind of explain what manual therapy is in a PT context, and then maybe some kind of common misconceptions with how it helps people?
So manual therapy in PT is basically anything where we have our hands on our patients, and we are doing, typically it's used to either increase joint mobility or tissue mobility, to decrease overall pain, tenderness, and tone in muscles. So you think of that as some people look at PT as, oh, can't wait to go to PT and get a massage. We call that soft tissue mobilization or soft tissue massage. That would be one example. And we also have joint mobilizations, where we're actually working on improving mobility of the joint capsule itself. Graston techniques. There's all kinds of things out there, but ultimately the goal is to typically increase tissue mobility with manual therapy. So this is something that's done a lot in the clinic. I know personally right now where I'm working, I do it on every single patient. Usually massage, sometimes joint mobilizations or something like that. But of course, this is another one of those misconceptions and kind of an old school concept about PT. I have a lot of patients that come to PT just for the massage. That's why they come.
That's why they're there. They want it.
That's what's making them better. And is that what's making them better? No. But it does hold some merit again, because it gets them in the door, and
yes,
it makes them happy. And we'll either start the session or we'll end the session with it, depending on what we're doing that session, depending on how the patient's feeling that day. So it can either be a good motivation, like get your exercises done and then you'll get some massage at the end.
Right.
But what we really want to avoid is having patients or clients reliant on that. The goal is to, build their trust, make them feel comfortable with PT, let them know that this is going to be a pleasant experience, but then eventually educate them and teach them that this isn't really what's helping them long term. What's helping them is, unfortunately for them, everything that's going to help you is active. Nothing that's really going to help you is passive. It requires your own work. But once you figure that out and you gain their trust a little bit, then they'll start to believe you and they'll actually buy into these exercises, and that's when they start to get better. So does manual therapy help your injury heal? Not really, but can it be a useful tool to help patients with their rehab process? Definitely.
I liken manual therapy to kind of more of a advanced form of static stretching. What I mean by that is it's somewhat working on a similar result, meaning we're trying to, like Morgan mentioned, decrease tone, decrease perceived tension. There's the common idea that, well, if you massage or use a Theragun, you can bring blood flow to the tissue. That one's not really substantiated much, even with deep tissue massage. It seems like the blood flow mainly pulls at the skin. Feels good, right? And it might be, like Morgan said, I really like that she mentioned that. It's like a good buy-in or trust builder, right? Someone comes to you, you've never met them before. They come to you and they say, my shoulder hurts. I've heard this Theragun or this massage technique can really help. If you just go to that person, you're like, well, you don't know what you're talking about. That stuff doesn't work. There's no research. It doesn't do anything. The person's going to probably walk out the door and go find someone who will do it.
Exactly.
Right? So even though research might say one thing, we might have to get to know the person, but help them buy into the process. And then when they trust us, and they acknowledge our profession and they say, oh, okay, I can rely on Damien or Morgan, then we can start talking like, hey, like, you don't need to do this anymore, man. You're resilient, you're strong, you're feeling better. You don't need the Theragun, you don't need this or that, right? Because when it comes to manual therapy, unless you're doing it on yourself, like SMR, like using a foam roller or Theragunning yourself, I mean, even if you buy those tools, they can be quite expensive. Like static stretching is free, unless you go to like a stretch zone or something and someone stretches you out. But getting Graston techniques, getting massages, those can be expensive. They can add up real quick. Now, if you have the disposable income, and there's the psychological side of this, which I like an even higher, to static stretching. Some people, when they get massages, it just completely de-stresses them. They feel much better psychologically. They get a bunch of benefits like that. That I understand. But know that you don't have to spend a stupid amount of money to get these reoccurring massages or reoccurring, mobility treatments or, soft tissue mobilization treatments. And here's the thing too. If you're constantly doing them and nothing's changing, you're going to have to constantly keep doing them to feel better. So you got to find something else to supplement to get you in the right direction, because you shouldn't need to get soft tissue mobilization for the rest of your life. You might feel good and you want to get massages for the rest of your life. That's fine. But in order to maybe rehab from an injury or anything, the vast majority of people do not need to constantly get soft tissue mobilization. It's not doing you a service in the long term, I should say.
Definitely. I'm never happier than when a patient comes in and they're into their exercises, they're getting better, and they say to me, I don't need to do a massage today. At the end of the day, I'm like,
that's right.
That's what I like to hear. They know, as great as massage feels, knowing that's not what's making them better. And again, over time, PT and strength and conditioning and personal training, all of that is always a balance between what your patient or what your client wants and what they need.
Yes.
You do need to give them what they want to some extent. And if you start off and build that relationship with them and give them a little bit of what they want, but then over time, educate them on more what they need and what's going to make them better, that's where you get a successful outcome, a happy patient that's going to have long-term benefits.
Morgan's doing what we call mental jujitsu, ladies and gentlemen. You saw that. Build trust, build relations, and then client comes in and says, I don't need that. That's what I'm talking about. So yes, going back to my podcast that I recently did with Katie Hoff, psychology of coaching, building trust, building relationships, even in the physical therapy realm, right? That is paramount if you're going to work with your client and best set them up for success.
Right. I will say it's tricky too, because you want to give them what they want early on, but you also don't want to be that pushover, I guess, where they're like, oh, I can just use this girl to do exactly what I want now. So it's a balancing act, as is everything. You just have to figure out the right amount of pushing them a little bit, but also making them happy, making sure they leave happy and they want to come back for more.
Yes, 100% agree with that. The last myth we're going to talk about, and Morgan, you take a little break. I'm going to start this one off because this is one that I like to go into a lot, and that is posture. I'm going to put a link, gentlemen over at painscience.com. Really, really good article, really good content about posture. And this is one I really focus on because from a personal training standpoint, it's kind of harped on quite a bit. And I think overall, it's not as important as maybe we once thought it was. So when I'm talking posture, I'm going to, in this context, I'm sure I'll have Morgan back on in the future and we'll talk a little bit more about variability in movement and dynamic posture. But when I'm talking about posture right now, I'm talking about static posture, meaning just how you are generally at a resting state, whether you're standing upright or you're seated, in a way that balances your body in a particular way so you can be more or less upright, again, seated or standing. The common belief, and we're taught this as personal trainers, I used to teach an ACE personal training prep course for the last about 3 years. And there's always a big part about static stretching, scar tissue, postural deviations, improper biomechanics, things like that. And the common thing, kind of going off of tight muscles and weak muscles, is posture has a perfect outline, right? There's kind of this, perfect lines. One shoulder is not higher than the other. The ear is in line with, the center of your glenohumeral joint, in line with your hip, in line with your knee, in line with your lateral malleolus, right? It all is going to be a nice straight line. Everything is perfectly symmetrical. Here's the first problem with that. Number one, as we mentioned with cadavers, people are not symmetrical. In fact, we're very asymmetrical. Here's a very, obvious example. Most of us are right or left-hand dominant, right? Most of us, which means that your entire life you're going to be doing something that's imbalanced. And that's natural because we aren't just a car or machine that wears down over time. Take a car. If your car is favoring one side over the other, yes, it's going to unevenly wear down. You might have issues with your steering or your alignment, and now your car is wearing to one side where the other side isn't. That's a problem in a car. The reason that's a problem in a car is because cars don't adapt to stress. Human beings do. We adapt to stress. We kind of like progressive overload in a sense, and then our body becomes accustomed to it, and then we gain new adaptations from it. So I'm right-hand dominant. I can use my left hand for most things. I can't write. I won't show you because it's horrible. But it's a good thing I'm right-hand dominant and that I develop patterns that way because now I'm very proficient in doing what I need to do. Same thing at work. If you're a server and you're carrying a tray, or if you are a lefty and maybe you play sport and you use your left hand, you're going to develop imbalances naturally. And that's a good thing because as human beings, we live in a world that isn't symmetrical either. Everything we do is asymmetrical and we adapt to it. When it comes to posture, there really isn't a perfect posture. There are different postures that are maybe more beneficial for certain people. I know in physical therapy, a big thing that's coming in is what we call flexion tolerance or intolerance, meaning some people might be better more or less in a more upright position, but other people might feel better with a slight hunch. That's just how their body is structured and what is comfortable for them. The misconception is that if you are not in these perfectly straight lines, if you don't have a perfect erect posture, you're going to cause injuries down the road. Because what's going to happen is you're going to have uneven length tension relationships, meaning one muscle is going to be constantly elongated, another muscle is going to be constantly shortened. Because those muscles pull on structures like disc, joints, bones, over time, it's going to cause issues in those areas, which cause injury over time. What we're seeing is that, well, number one, just because you're in a position doesn't mean that a muscle is tight or that a muscle is weak or loose or whatever. But number two, posture doesn't seem to correlate very well with pain and injury. As I mentioned, you can look from general population all the way to the athletic level. You're going to find people who have quote unquote perfect posture that have chronic pain with no identifiable cause. And you're going to have people who look hunched over, like the Hunchback of Notre Dame, and their entire life they're fine, and there's nothing wrong with them. So the two common examples I go to with personal training, the two ones that were always taught, kyphosis, anterior pelvic tilt. Kyphosis, for those who don't know, sometimes called upper cross syndrome, is when you have this kind of internal rotation of the shoulders, right? They call it the keyboard warrior pose. Head juts forward, right? And they say, oh, your chest is tight and your scapular adductors, the things that pull your shoulders back, are weak. Again, a lot of this research that we do when we're looking at things like kyphosis or anterior pelvic tilt, where the pelvis is tilting forward, there's not a very good correlation to pain or injury. Most of us have an anterior pelvic tilt. It's just natural. Most people don't have a neutrally aligned pelvis. You're going to have a slight lordotic curve in your back. That's natural. And again, you can't just look at a muscle like if you look at someone's, shoulders rotated forward or their pelvis tilted forward. You can't look at that and say, oh, that's tight, that's weak. It doesn't work that way. You could have someone who has internally rotated shoulders and has a very strong back, even though you would think those muscles are weak because they can't keep the shoulders in place. That might just be how they are oriented. What we do know is that, and this is mentioned in the article I'm going to link, is that your best posture might be your next posture, meaning that it's good in general to move in different ways. The body likes movement variety, meaning if you are someone who is hunched over a lot on the computer, it might be a good idea to try and be more upright or get up and walk at times. On the flip side, if you're someone who always sits erect, tall and you still feel like I'm in pain, even though I'm like perfectly aligned and everything, maybe try slouching a little bit. Maybe try moving in different directions and see if you feel better, because the body over time doesn't like to be in the same position over and over and over again. It likes movement variability. Morgan, I know I just kind of spitball a lot of stuff. You couldn't tell like talking about this. Well, there you go. What would you like to add about posture in terms of the realm of physical therapy?
I was going to agree with you completely. So, of course, I think the issue with posture is more avoiding prolonged postures the best that you can, like you said, because there's the concept of creep. If you guys are unfamiliar with what creep is, over time, if you're in a static position for a long time, the muscles, maybe the discs, if you're slouching, the tendons, the fascia, they are going to gradually change form a little bit. They might, if you're hunched over, your back muscles, they're going to lengthen, and that's natural. And yes, that can cause some discomfort, some pain. They say sitting is the new smoking now. But so the problem is more with prolonged postures and just being static and passive all the time, not so much what posture you're in. And I mean, you need to be able to handle multiple different postures that you're going to be in throughout the day too. For example, athletes are in crazy positions all the time. What are you going to tell them to do? Oh, just don't let your knee cave in like that.
Ever.
That's not good. Don't do it. Sorry, but when they're sprinting down the field and they have to cut and turn away from someone who's trying to tackle them, I don't think they're going to be able to figure out. They're not going to think what posture they're in. So you have to prepare the body for any demands that you're going to place on it. So say there's an actual rehab exercise for people where you are hunching your spine and lifting something from the floor very slowly in a controlled manner to build good both concentric and eccentric strength in that posture, in that positioning, if that's something that you have to do throughout your day.
Yeah.
So the issue is just being prepared and being conditioned to handle certain postures that your body will be placed in, and constantly changing that when we can. Sitting in one position for a very long time, you're going to start to feel stiff. You're going to have that concept of creep. Things are going to change shape and form a little bit throughout your body tissues. And that can be as easily fixed as just constantly changing. Luckily for me, I'm a very antsy person. I've always been. So I'm never sitting in one position too long. You'll see me shaking my leg. You'll see me like turning a bunch of different ways. And so far I haven't had any pain or issues with that. So maybe I can attribute it to my constant changing of positions.
There's your anecdotal evidence for posture for the day, folks.
And also, that's another one. I'm going to say this over and over again, but I just think it's so important for anyone to always remember to assess, not assume. You have a patient come into the clinic and they say, hey, I have neck pain. And you look at their posture. And yeah, a lot of that, especially older patients, they do have that kyphosis. They have kind of a forward head posture, internally rotated shoulders. And if you assume, you're assuming that they have weak scapular retractors, weak rhomboids, weak middle traps, and they have tight pecs or tight internal rotators of the shoulder. They have weak, deep neck flexors. If you actually test those muscles, do an MMT is what we would do as physical therapists to kind of test and grade the strength of a muscle. You might find that they're perfectly strong and nothing's matching up with what we're taught. Oh, they're in this hunch position, but their retractors are actually very strong. So how is strengthening them anymore going to help for that issue? You need to address a patient's strengths and weaknesses. You have to address their weaknesses and work on them so that they don't have those impairments anymore. But that takes assessing what the actual problem is in the first place.
Absolutely. One thing that we do know about posture, and I've learned this recently, is that posture might be actually a good indicator for mood. Kind of the psychology behind this is someone who has generally a more open posture usually has higher levels of happiness or feelings of satisfaction or feeling good about themselves. Individuals who might be experiencing depression, anxiety, or more so just feelings of being down might have a more recluse posturers do not bring attention to themselves. So posture might be a good inclination as to how someone is feeling. And funny part, or I shouldn't say funny, the ironic part about that is, people who have higher levels of depression and anxiety experience higher levels or more frequent levels of pain, but not necessarily the posture is causing the pain or issue in of itself. The last thing I'll say about posture, more so about the spine. People think like, bending the spine in certain directions or the way the spine's position might be bad, etc. A lot of studies that look at spinal mechanics, or some studies that are used to claim about spinal mechanics or spinal posture and injury, some are used on cadaver studies or quadrupeds, animals that are on all fours. While these aren't completely invalid, the difference between us and a cadaver is that cadavers, like a car, cannot adapt. It's almost like, in a sense, like I mentioned, progressive overload. If you gradually expose yourself to positions and postures like Morgan mentioned with the athlete over time, you will adapt to the stressor in a way that you can handle it. Because again, we want to make sure that we can be in various positions and adapt to various stressors over time. So that way, if need be, we can go into our bag and use that when we need to. A spine doesn't adjust when it's in the cadaver. So you can bend, twist it, flex it all you want, and eventually it's going to break or a disc is going to bulge, and it's going to stay that way because guess what? Cadavers don't adapt. Quadruped isn't a good example because we're bipedal, right? We stand up when we walk. We're not on all fours, so our mechanics in general are completely different. Again, not invalid, but I wouldn't say it's a very good model to compare us to. Morgan, is there anything else you want to hit on before we get into our last section?
No, this is a good one too. So I'm all good with posture. We can get into the pain.
Yes. So if you haven't read my second blog post about pain and perceptions, highly recommend checking it out because that's parts we're going to reference right here. And the third blog post that I will be releasing is going to be talking about, okay, you have pain and you've gotten all the red flags out of the way, which we're going to talk about. How do I go about training? Or as a coach, how do I go about programming that stays in my scope of practice? So the first thing we always want to figure out is when it comes to training, let's make sure we're safe, right? Because safety is going to be number one concern, whether it's your patient, your client, whatever. We got to make sure we got any red flags or contraindications out of the way before we proceed. So Morgan, if someone is experiencing pain, but they know they need to get into training, whether with you or with a coach, what are some of those things that's like, hey, if you're noticing these signs and symptoms, you should probably consult your physician or potentially even go to the emergency room and make sure you're okay before starting training?
Well, first thing that you always want to look out for is it actually a musculoskeletal issue? Is there a mechanical pattern? So someone comes in with, say, shoulder pain, and you do an exam on them and you're checking to see what movements aggravate it, what movements relieve the pain. And a true musculoskeletal injury typically will have aggravating and relieving factors. If it's kind of a constant, always there, nothing seems to make it better, it's always a lingering pain, you already want to start thinking, okay, that this could be something else. So keep your mind open to, say, other visceral issues, like other organs could be causing the issue, could be something rheumatological, like autoimmune. So you always have to keep those options in the back of your head, especially if it doesn't seem to have true mechanical aggravating factors. Then something that's important to know are constitutional symptoms. So something that you should check with patients to see if they've had any other weird symptoms. You'd like to believe that your patients and clients are going to tell you everything, but oftentimes you have to drag it out of them. You have to keep asking follow-up questions because they don't see why mentioning something is relevant to what you guys are doing together. They don't see if the night sweats they've been having are relevant to what you're doing with them. So you kind of have to dig and ask those questions. So constitutional symptoms would include if they have other odd symptoms like a fever, they're having lots of headaches, say they're having nausea, vomiting, dizziness, sweating, fainting, things like that, excessive weight loss. Those are symptoms that are making you think it's potentially outside of your scope of practice and they might need to follow up with a physician or even potentially go to the emergency room depending on what's going on. So those are things that are important to look out for right away, and recognizing the difference between musculoskeletal versus some other organ or some other system causing the problem.
Yes. I would also say you want to this is kind of obvious, but we got to make sure we say it, is some of the other things that, maybe not necessarily immediate danger, or well, this first one will be, but other things that maybe it's like, well, okay, I might need to refer to PT or physician first before I get clearance. First one is if there's visible trauma, right? Like if a bone's where it shouldn't be, let's go somewhere. Or if like red hot swollen joint with severe amount of pain, if you have pain that is consistent, debilitating, and kind of like Morgan said, just pain that doesn't go away, lingers, or if you have like sharp, debilitating, constant pain, it's like, yeah, let's go get that checked out. If you lose function, so this might be like a neurological issue, which again is kind of out of the scope, specifically for coaches. I know PTs do some work in the neurological area, but if you like don't have function of a limb, like if you're like, I can't really feel my arm feels weak, I can't really move it, or I don't really have good action or muscle tone to my leg, okay, maybe we should get that figured out. And kind of going with that with the neurological is maybe loss of certain function of organs. Maybe like you're having trouble controlling your bladder or your bowel movements, right? That could also be something where it's like, hey, it's not life-threatening right now, but like maybe we should get that checked out, make sure everything's good neurologically before we proceed and move you through physical therapy or strength and conditioning. So coaches, PTs, got the red flags out of the way. We know they're okay. Maybe they had to go get doctor's clearance. They signed off. Hey, they're good to go. Now they're with you. Okay. So we got a client and they're working through some pain and injury. What do we do? The first thing, again, going back to my blog post, is understanding the concept of pain and perception. I'm not going to go through everything, so it's going to be the TLDR real quick, is that pain is a very, very complicated phenomenon. It goes into biological, psychological, and social factors. That means that if someone is experiencing pain, that doesn't necessarily just mean that it is purely a tissue damage and purely a biological phenomenon. That is part of the equation. The example I always like to give my students is, hey, you had someone who got into a car accident and they shattered their femur. Highly biological, right? It's like you had a person who just injured their system, immense amount of trauma to the body, right? Okay, that's pretty biological. What do we say to the person who has had chronic lower back pain for the majority of their life and they get an MRI and it's clean? What do we say to them? What we're finding more often than not is that tissue damage, while it can be in some instances, like I mentioned with the car accident example, but tissue damage in general isn't the best predictor of injury and pain correlation, and vice versa. Because number one, and we won't get too into injury specifically in the definitions here, but injury is hard to define, right? When you work out, you're causing trauma of your muscle. You're actually breaking down the muscle fiber. Is that considered an injury? Maybe, because you are breaking down tissue. You are causing tissue damage. But it's a small enough amount that your body can adapt to over time. When we look at things like MRIs, CT scans, and we see things that are looked at as abnormal, they might be classified as pathological. But it is a potential that they might just be normal adaptations. So one example I'll give, I mentioned with Katie about the Mosley study when I did my last podcast about psychology of coaching. So if you want to hear about placebo surgeries, I would check that out. But one study I'm going to mention here was a study by Burkinji et al. I'm sorry, I butchered that poor person's name, but that was the best that I could do. They did a systematic review looking at MRI studies. One of the studies was a CT scan. I think it was 33 studies. I'll be sure to link it. One was a CT scan, the rest were MRIs. And they had over 3,100 participants. So big sample size, right? And they split all their participants into age groups by decade. You had the 20 to 29-year-olds, the 30 to 39-year-olds, all the way up to 80 to 89 years of age. In order to be in the study, you had to be what's called asymptomatic, meaning you had no evidence or no history of a back injury, and you weren't currently experiencing any symptoms of pain or injury for your lower back. And they all got MRIs. And they wanted to see what the prevalence was of so-called tissue damage or tissue abnormalities in the lower back of these individuals. Again, none of them had symptoms. They were all healthy, no injuries. What did they find? They found that things like, DDD, degenerative disc disease, disc bulging, spondylolisthesis, all these things, they're quite common and progress along the lifespan. Meaning Morgan and I are between the age of 20 to 29. There's a 33% chance if you looked at our MRI that we would have degenerating disc disease, meaning the space between our vertebrae is getting smaller and smaller, which is usually viewed as a bad thing because it means that you're getting closer to quote unquote bone on bone. When you get up to 80 to 89, if I remember correctly, it's close to 90 or about 90%. But again, all these people are asymptomatic, no issues with pain or injury or function. So it's prevalent in our age. It gets almost to 100% as you get older, but these people are going about their day like no one's business. And the authors had a really powerful quote at the end. They said, these should be considered normal age-related changes, not pathological findings. And that's crazy because historically we think that anything that doesn't fit the textbook, like we were talking about, where we look at textbook cadavers, right? What they look like in the book. We used to think that anything that doesn't fit the norm is a pathology. It needs to be corrected. But the new research coming out is showing that that might not be the case. We see similar instances in rotator cuff issues, from everyday people to even Major League Baseball players, where if you did an MRI on their shoulder, you're going to see a rotator cuff tear. It's quite common, actually. But yet you have people normal every day, functioning just fine, to professional athletes performing at the highest level of their skill with rotator cuff tears. What they're saying is that potentially the way that we're viewing it through the MRI, these might actually just be adaptations that the body has to perform at a high level. The other tricky part, and I'll leave on this so Morgan can jump in here, is that we're also not the best at interpreting MRIs. I have no idea how to read an MRI. I won't pretend like I do. But there's some studies that show that when they take multiple physicians and they try to compare their diagnostic on a particular image from an MRI, they'll all give different results. That's kind of like when you go get a second opinion for your doctor. One doctor might say one thing, one doctor might say another, and they might even be reading the same test and get a different result. So, sum this up, very complicated to look at tissue abnormalities and classify them as pathologies. And we also have trouble reading MRIs in the first place. That makes it very tricky. Morgan, do you have anything to add to kind of the tissue damage, pain injury kind of side of things?
Yeah, so this is so important in PT now, especially since pain, pretty much all your patients are pain patients now. Biggest chief complaint that you're going to deal with in physical therapy is pain. People don't typically come in because they're not as strong as they'd like to be. They typically come in because they're in pain and they want to fix that. So we have to learn how to deal with these patients that are in pain and manage them. So going to the MRIs and CT scans and how iffy those can be, like we said, tissue damage does not equal pain. So you can have asymptomatic individuals that have significant MRI findings, or you can have people with no significant MRI findings that are in a lot of pain. And like you said, there are many inconsistencies. They do teach us in PT school how they at least give us a basic understanding of how to read radiographs, MRI, CT scans. And I will tell you, it's highly subjective. You'll ask everyone in the classroom and everyone will notice something different. So those are not the greatest indicator of how we should treat our patients. So what we're treating with patients is we're not treating their scans, we're treating their impairments. Mm-hmm. We're doing an assessment of, are they impaired? Do they have impairments in their strength, in their range of motion, in their just their overall function? And we're treating those individual impairments to get them back to functioning, and that's what's going to make them leave feeling happy and healthy and able to go on in their day-to-day lives, not the fact that you treated them for degenerative disc disease because that's what their MRI says they have. Because oftentimes that's what their MRI will say, and they don't even present with symptoms consistent with what the MRI report says.
Yeah, you might just find something that the person didn't even know they had, and it doesn't matter. And this kind of goes into the last point I want to talk about, which is when we read this, and again, people come to us because we're the professionals and we're trying to provide knowledge and expertise to help guide them to a particular goal they're trying to achieve or rehab setting they're trying to achieve, right? And that's the thing I mentioned with Katie last time as well, is the movement avoidance and kinesiophobia. So kinesiophobia is exactly what it sounds like. It's fear of movement. This happens sometimes with people when they get a diagnosis or they have an experienced pain and they become fearful of movement. This can be reinforced with certain diagnoses. For example, the common idea, like we were talking about, is I get an MRI because maybe I had back pain. I find something on my MRI that is abnormal. Therefore, my spine, my disc, whatever structure was identified, is now in a weakened state. Therefore, if I stress that area, be resistance training, whatever it may be, I'm going to further damage and cause more issues long term. So the idea, and I've heard people say this, that their doctor told them this, is if you have back pain or you have an MRI that says you have a disc bulge, you shouldn't squat or deadlift. I'm here to tell you, always get doctor's clearance first, but I'm here to tell you, no, you should squat and you should deadlift, because guess what? You're going to do it for the rest of your life, even if you don't want to anyway. You're going to pick up your grandkid, you're going to bring in the groceries, you're going to squat down to pick something up, you're going to squat and deadlift whether you want to or not. It's part of movement biomechanics for people, everything we do on a daily basis. And here's the good news. Things like bulging disc, while maybe adaptations occur, and that's why we see them in MRIs, most of the time they tend to resolve themselves. We have research where we can look at someone's back, see maybe a bulging or slight herniated disc, and then 6 weeks later, it recedes. And for most people, that's the norm. So it's not something to necessarily be so worried about as like a death sentence. And the problem with getting these diagnosis or this statement from healthcare professionals, and I've been guilty of it myself, because I used to think that certain movements or certain injuries meant I had to stay away from exercise, is we create this fear avoidance model in kinesiophobia. I get told something is bad because I'm now broken. I lose my autonomy. I lose my resilience. Now I avoid these movement patterns because these movement patterns are going to further inhibit me or hurt me. I now become less active because I fear of hurting myself further. Fast forward 10, 15, 20 years, I'm still in pain and I'm less physically active than I ever was. And that's why, partly why I wrote the article, blog post number 2, is because we know that people are physically inactive. And a big reason is because a lot of people are in pain. 50 million Americans, about 20% of the population, reported having chronic pain. That's pain lasting 6 months or longer. Who the hell wants to be, when I have pain, I don't want to work out. It sucks. Why would you want to move when you're in pain? But in most cases, when those red flags are gone, and Morgan, I'll let you speak to this last point. In most cases, when you're with a good professional that's supervising you, you have to find ways that you can move. Even if there's a little bit of pain, even if there's a little discomfort, you have to find ways you can move to strengthen those areas, to work on those ranges of motion, to work in those particular movement patterns. So that way you can adapt to it and get through it.
Exactly. Movement is medicine.
Yes.
So, and yes, with certain injuries, there are movements that need to be avoided for certain time periods, especially, of course, if you're working with, say, post-surgical patients and have to deal with protocols. Yes, you might have to avoid externally rotating your shoulder past 30 degrees for the first 4 weeks or something like that. But the language we use with our patients, how we interact with our patients and reassure them and motivate them is so important in our clients. So important, because we are either adding to their fear avoidance behaviors, or we are helping manage it and building up confidence and making them realize, wow, like I'm capable, I can do this, I'm okay, and I'm getting better every day. So I have a good story that was great to see the other day from working in the clinic. We had a patient who had surgery on her. She fractured her ulna, so she had surgery. It was fixated, and she's been in a brace. She's able to now remove the brace. She's able to start initiating some range of motion now that she's cleared post-surgery. But she's terrified, and things don't feel right, and she believes something's wrong. Something went wrong with the surgery, and she's not okay. they're going to have to go back in and fix the surgery because this isn't right. And while you have to consider, okay, potentially she could be right, maybe something's going on, but you also have to look at, okay, this is normal. You haven't moved your wrist for months.
Yep.
You now have metal insertions where you used to have bone. Like, things are going to be different. It's not going to feel the same. And you start off, you take what you can get at first. You start off with some very light range of motion, either passive where you're doing it for the patient if they trust you, or a lot of times they'll respond better because they'll feel in more control if they're the one that's kind of moving it at first a little bit, even if they're not moving through a full range, just so they see, okay, this is okay. Gradually, maybe you try to push them a little bit further. Maybe you actively assist them while they are performing the motion. And over time, this patient just became, she's apprehensive. Everything we wanted to do with her, very simple motions, just, they were scary. She didn't want to do them. And one thing that a mistake I noticed that I made, and now I see how I could have done better, is one day I was like, wow, you're doing so great. I'll have to give you some weights next time. And she looked at me like, weights?
Whoa.
No, she's like, I'm never doing that. And then my boss the next day, so my CI, who's been a practicing physical therapist for like 24 years now, he came in and he didn't make any fuss about it. No big deal. He just handed her the weights and it's like, this is what you're doing. You're doing this now. And she just did it. And he was like, that's what you needed to do. So every patient client's different with how you manage them. And you really, really need to individualize it based on who you're working with. But for her, just not even like making it seem like it was no big deal. It's just normal. This is what you're going to do. And she did it. And she was like, wow, look at me. Like, I can do this. And it was something as simple as just doing some wrist curls with 1 pound weights right now. Yep. But that was huge for her. And every day she's developing more and more confidence and less fear of movement. So how we interact with our patients is so critical. It's such a psychological aspect to physical therapy or personal training or strength and conditioning. And we really have to tailor that to the individual. And we do have to empathize with our patients that are in pain.
Yes.
But we also cannot help kind of let them stay in this negative cycle of, oh, this is horrible. My life is awful. I'm never going to get through this. We have to encourage them the best we can while still showing some empathy for them.
Absolutely.
And that's another difficult balancing act that we have to do.
Help people become resilient.
Exactly.
That's a big part of our job, because resilient people are independent people, and independent people keep lifelong behaviors with them, and they're happier and they're healthier.
For sure.
Morgan, I think that's a great place to end. Thank you again so much for coming on. Again, people, Morgan is going to be one of the best physical therapists out there. I'm telling you, you heard it here first. She's going to change the industry for sure. I can't wait to see what happens, and she will be back on. We have plenty more topics we wanted to talk about, but we wanted to make sure we got at least a few of them out of the way on the very first one. Morgan, can you let the people know where they can find you, Instagram handle, if you have anything else that you want to plug?
Yeah, definitely. So my Instagram handle is Morgs, MORGS _X03. So don't blame me for that name. It was a high school name that I just kept, okay? Gonna have to work on that one. But yeah, Instagram's probably the best place to follow me right now. And if you guys are interested, I'll definitely start posting more PT-related content. I haven't done too much of that yet, but I would happily do that for anyone interested.
She's busy in her PT and sure, people. Okay, give her some slack. But yes, definitely follow Morgan. She does also post really cool stuff, really cool workout stuff too. Good motivation. She does the gut check every now and again. Oh, yeah. Really good workout stuff. If you're looking for me, as always, Instagram handle at @the_shift_method. You can head over to theshiftmethod.org. Check out blog post number 2. All the stuff we talked about today, we're going to make sure we have references down in the description so that way you guys can read along, check out the studies we're mentioning, so that way you guys can feel included in the conversation as much as possible. Again, that's theshiftmethod.com or theshiftmethod.org. So you can see blog post number 2, check out merchandise, services, whatever you want to look at, an Instagram handle at @the_shift_method. Morgan, thank you so much again. I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. All right.
Awesome. You too.
Bye.
Bye.